Hello and welcome to another episode of Prash's Murder Map. Now today we're doing something a little bit different. Instead of a case, we're talking about our latest book, Wartime London's Bonnie and Clyde, the crime spree of Betty Jones and Karl Hulten. I'm joined by my wife and co-author Melissa, and she's going to tell you a bit about the book and then we're going to take it from there.
Hello. Yes, I'm usually in the background helping out with the cases, so it's very different for me to be in front of the microphone today. So when people hear the phrase Wartime London's Bonnie and Clyde, they often think they already know this case, but most accounts actually focus on just a few sensational days in 1944 when George Edward Heath was shot dead by an 18-year-old Welsh dancer named Elizabeth Jones, known as Betty, and a 22-year-old American named Karl Hulten, who was absent without leave from the US Army. It was also referred to in the newspapers as the Cleft Chin Murder or the Inky Fingers Murder. But what we wanted to do was step back and look at the whole picture. So that meant examining Betty Jones's childhood in South Wales and Karl Hulten's early life in America, and asking the question, how did these two people with very different backgrounds come together and collide in wartime London? So the 6-day crime spree and the fatal shooting of the taxi driver do sit at the centre of the story, but that's not the end of it, because we also look at what happened to Betty after she came out of prison, how the case affected the families involved, and the lives that were affected long after the headlines faded, including the victims. As part of that research, we were able to trace and speak to Elizabeth's daughter and Karl's daughter, which is something that has never been done before, and in fact, Elizabeth's daughter, nobody actually knew she existed until we were able to track her down, so it was really exciting and such a privilege to be able to speak to her and hear from her about her mother's later life. So, Prash, do you want to tell your listeners what first drew you to this case and why you think it deserved a full-length book?
Yeah, of course. So my connection to this case goes back many years to a man called Ted. Ted was a family friend of ours many years ago, and he had been an aircraftman for the RAF during the Second World War. And we would occasionally go and visit him at his house. On one particular occasion, I think I was about 12 years old at the time, we went to see him, and one thing that I loved looking at was the pictures he had. He had pictures of old planes like, for example, Spitfires, Lancaster bombers, and some of them had him standing in front of them. He also was an avid collector of things like old cigarette cards, coins, stamps, newspaper clippings. And it was the newspaper clippings I was actually rummaging through, and then I came across a brown folder with the name Elizabeth Jones and Karl Hulten dossier. I opened it up, and the first thing I saw was a photograph of Betty, or Elizabeth, aged 14. So she looked like a typical schoolgirl, dark hair. Flicked over to the next page, it was a complete transformation. It was 4 years later, she was now 18, and this picture had been taken in London. She had blonde hair. To my eyes, she looked like a Hollywood actress, reminiscent of Ted's cigarette card collection, the actresses on those particular cards. So I carried on flicking through the information, came across some more photographs, some what appeared to be personal letters, other statements, and they appeared to be written by people who knew Betty and Karl. So I asked Ted about it, because my immediate thought was, is it some kind of espionage or spy-related stuff during the war? So Ted explained to me that Elizabeth and Karl had murdered a man called George Edward Heath, who'd been a private car hire driver, and this murder had occurred in 1944. It was then in 1946 that Ted was at the Cleft Chin Murder exhibition in Bridgewater, Somerset, which is actually what was happening there was they were exhibiting the murder car, which was a Ford V8. This was the car that George Heath had been shot in, and there were still the bullet marks on the inside the car, and a woman by the name of Violet Hodge was sitting in the front seat, regaling the story to the crowd, which numbered in the thousands, of her near brush with death, of how Karl and Betty had attacked her and left her for dead in October 1944. This was before the murder of George Edward Heath. So Ted spoke to Violet, but then he also ran into one of his old army friends. And this man was going to be going overseas, but he had made a personal study of the case. And he'd been at the trial as well. He'd taken some notes. He'd spoken to some of the people that were involved in the case, people that knew Betty and Karl. And he had also put some photographs together. And as he was going overseas, he decided didn't need this dossier anymore. So he handed it over to Ted and said, look, you can do whatever you want with it. I know how much you like collecting stuff. And then years later, he gave it to me. And I've had it ever since. And later, I decided to take some time out from the podcast that I was running and research this case properly, find out what happened to some of the key characters, find out, most importantly, what happened to Betty. Because after she left jail in 1954, there were many rumours being bandied about, such as she'd become a nun or she'd died penniless on the south coast. All of those rumours were incorrect, of course, and I was really driven to find out what happened to her. So it was a case of really researching this case in depth, finding out more information, and also tracking down Betty's daughter, who was able to shed some more light on this as well. And obviously from there we got speaking to Karl's daughter as well, and really filled in a lot of the blanks. And for me, I was driven by kind of closure, and very passionate about this case to get this story out there and provide information that had never been publicly disclosed before.
So when you looked through all those archives and those records, what did you actually find out about Betty's early life and her childhood and young adulthood up until the point that she met Karl Hulten in London?
Yeah, so Elizabeth Maud Jones, known as Betty, was born in 1926 in Skewen, South Wales, to parents Arthur and Ellie Baker. They were very respectable working class parents. However, Arthur did have difficulty finding work. He did have some experience doing some mining and a little bit of farm work as well. Oh yes, I also should say that Elizabeth did have an older sister named Gladys, who was a year older. In July 1929, when Elizabeth was 3, her family emigrated to Canada under the Empire Settlement Act. The Empire Settlement Act is basically a scheme that was put in place so that British workers who were either out of work or struggling could go to Canada to work the land. Because at this point, Canada was very much a vast country. It was a relatively new country at that point, but they didn't have enough workers. So there was an encouragement to send people from Britain to go and work there, with the government assisting them with travel costs and finding them accommodation as well. Sadly for the family, however, the decision proved financially disastrous. They could barely make ends meet, and as a result, Betty and Gladys were taken into care by the Children's Aid Society. Arthur then gave up on the dream of farming, and the family returned to Wales in 1933. The family then resettled in Neath, which is a neighbouring town to Skewen. Betty then later reported to her mother that she'd been sexually assaulted. The first occasion happened when she was 9 years old. This didn't really lead to anything legally. Age 13, however, it did go to court when she made another allegation against another man. But she was so frightened to give evidence that the case was effectively dismissed due to lack of evidence. After the court case, war was brewing in Europe, and Arthur had been sent away for military training. And it was around this time that Betty started running away from home. She started drinking. Her mother found it very difficult to control her and had her committed to the Northumberland Road Approved School for Girls in Sale, Cheshire. She was to be there until the age of 18. There were some positive and negative things that she got from the school. I mean, she learnt how to dance and she won awards for it. But at the same time, she hated being trapped in the school. She didn't get on particularly well with some of the teachers either, and as a result, she ran away from it a few times. She had this dream of wanting to go to London and be a professional dancer. On her school holidays, it's a bit like having a half term, I suppose. She'd go back to Neath and live with her mother and sister. And it was here that she reacquainted herself with 29-year-old Stanley Jones. Now, Stanley was a family friend and was currently a paratrooper for the Royal Artillery. They got married. She was 16 and he was 29. This meant she was no longer under the guardianship of the school. But after he assaulted her on their wedding night, she fled alone to London in search of fame and footlights. She lived precariously in wartime Soho. She worked in cafes and cabarets and was drawn into a seedy world of striptease dancing, sex, and she also got involved in the black market. And on one occasion she was bombed out of her lodgings. She then went to live in Hammersmith, and it was here in a cafe in October 1944 she met American paratrooper Private Karl Hulten, although he was going under the alias Lieutenant Richard John Allen. Melissa will now tell us a little bit of information about Karl.
Karl Gustav Holten's life started in Sweden. He was born in 1922 to his mother Signe Holten and an unknown father who left shortly after he was born. So when he was very young, Signe decided to emigrate with Karl to America, and they turned up in New York in 1923, right in that period of prohibition, organised crime, and gangsters like Al Capone. And Karl would later be fascinated by this. Signe then got married to another Swedish expat, and there was domestic violence in the household, so Signe then fled with Karl to Boston for a fresh start, and that's where they stayed. Signe worked very long hours as a housekeeper for very low wages, but she made sure there was always food on the table, and always wanted to bring up Karl well and comfortably. And in fact, she did spoil him a little bit because she liked to pay for his clothes and for his haircuts later, even after he was earning for himself. And he was very much interested in his appearance and in girls. He went to the Boston Farm and Trade School and he learned practical skills there, where he showed an aptitude for mechanics, and he continued to enjoy crime films and gangsters because they sometimes were taken to see films, and he had the opportunity to listen to some of the adventurous crime radio shows that were on at the time. After leaving school, he drifted between lots of short-term jobs, left up to 12 jobs within the space of a year because he just couldn't settle. He was restless and impulsive. And then in the summer of 1942, he met Rita Perot, who became pregnant shortly afterwards, and they got married in January of 1943. But just a few months later, he was drafted into the US Army. After his training, he was sent to England in 1944 as US and Canadian troops were arriving to join the European forces in preparing for the Normandy landings. Karl wouldn't be among them though, which was very disappointing for him. He would not be going to France with his colleagues. He was going to be stationed at a US Army base in Reading as a truck driver and a mechanic looking after the motor pool. He found this very boring and he was disillusioned, and he repeatedly went absent without leave. He would just slip out of the army base and drive around, go to the cinema and enjoy himself. And Hammersmith in particular was one of those areas he liked to visit. At one point, he was caught for carrying a loaded firearm and he was awaiting a court-martial. He broke out and went absent without leave again, embarking on a trail of petty crime. So at that point, he stole a US Army truck, he was selling stolen goods on the black market to make money, and this was what set the scene for his meeting with Betty Jones.
And that's when everything unfolds. The crime spree, the investigation, and the trial at the Old Bailey. Karl Hulten was executed, while Elizabeth Jones received a last-minute reprieve just 36 hours before she was due to hang. We also trace her life in prison, what happened afterwards involving her name change and remarrying, and her later years in America, where she died in 2006 at the age of 79. I'll leave the links in the show notes, including one to my website and book trailer, if you'd like to check it out. This has been a very challenging and rewarding experience for both of us, as this project has been about 2 years in the making. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen, and if you do decide to read the book, hope you enjoy it. I'll be back soon with another true crime episode.